Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Talks. I am Davide Scalenghe. Today, we are talking about mental health, identity, queerness, and power through the life of one person. I met today's guest, Matthew Jackman, in Geneva at the Care Not Custody event on the sidelines of the World Health Assembly. Care Not Custody is a global movement calling for an end to coercive institutional models of mental health care, arguing instead for rights-based, community-led support that puts people rather than systems at the center of care. Matthew joins us not only as an advocate, but as someone whose own journey has taken him through psychiatric hospitalisation, migration, activism, and today, the Med Pride movement. Matthew, or Matt, it's a real pleasure to have you. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's an honor to be part of all your distinguished guests.
You most certainly are a distinguished guest. Matt, let's start from the beginning. I heard some of this when we were in Geneva together, sitting next to each other. I was wearing a bright yellow jumper, and you were speaking in a way that moved me to the core. I remember that you started by talking about the family that you were born into. So can you tell us a little bit about that and what you remember the most about your childhood?
Yeah, so I think for many of us, our stories start intergenerationally. And for me, it really began on my mother's side of the family. So my nan, or my mother's mother, had children at a time where she felt compelled and forced to have children with her husband. And unfortunately, I think that led to, a lot of attachment issues and struggles with motherhood and being maternal. Inevitably, she told my mother that she didn't want to have children, and you can imagine the impact that has on a child, when you have a parent that's resentful at being in that role and having those responsibilities. So my mum grew up in a very conservative, very Irish Catholic household with a very cold mother. Her father was very warm, but I think she really struggled with that maternal relationship and essentially was looking for a way out to leave home as soon as possible, and eventually fell into the arms of my father, who was 17 years older and had 5 children with his first marriage already. And she was 18, 19 at the time. So, she was very much, I think, looking for a savior, and my father had a pattern in history of saving people, and I think part of that also his own trauma journey too. And he also lost his mother when he was 9 or 10 years of age of cancer. So it's interesting how our patterns of grief and trauma, infiltrate and influence our imprint for the next generation.
For sure. When did mental health first become part of your story? And how did you make sense of what was happening to you at the time?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, my mother and father were married. She was 19, he was 36. As I mentioned, my dad was very unsupportive of essentially my mother's decisions and didn't attend their wedding. So there was a lot of exclusion and social abandonment, which further, of course, impacted my mother. My mother, Samantha, always wanted children. So she had 3 children between the ages of 19 and 24. So she had me first and then my younger brother and sister. And after my younger brother, she had really, really severe postpartum or postnatal depression that evolved into psychosis. And she was institutionalized for the first time, at the age of, 22, and was in a difficult relationship with my father, who'd given up responsibilities to care for her. And so essentially they were living in poverty. She'd been rejected by her mother. So all these sort of social and structural issues had led to, I think, a lot of distress and despair and confusion about what the world meant for her. And then unfortunately, her mental health or distress really deteriorated from there. And, they were my parents were in a domestically violent relationship. We were removed from their care. My mother became very suicidal into her mid-20s, feeling essentially, hurt by her partner, abandoned by her parents, and struggling to support 3 young children on her own at times. And that led to her being, suicidal, which to me was a very human response to the situation, the context, the conditions that she was in. And unfortunately, at the age of 28, when we were in foster care, and we were in foster care because she'd also expressed wishes to kill herself with us as her children. So we were removed from her care due to that risk. And there was one moment I was in foster care where the social worker came to the door to take us to school. And they kept us back from school, and we were, playing with making feather hats, which I thought was very strange at 9 a.m. in the morning. And then, all I can remember is crying but also feeling a sense of relief, like I'd already known this was going to happen because I was such a parentified child growing up around all of my mother's distress and madness. So yeah, that's sort of the context and entry point of my own distress and despair, but growing up around it, madness and distress were very familiar to me. And I don't use the term mental illness because I don't think that what anyone in my family or myself has gone through is a pathology of the mind or the body or the soul. I think it's all related to the context of our lives. So yeah, that's sort of up until my early adolescence.
So your mother took her own life. What do you remember when you were so young about the years in which she was institutionalized? Did you go to see her? What's your again, I'm thinking of those who are listening to this or watching this and have never been in a psychiatric institution. What do they sound like, feel like, look like?
That's a great question. And my memories of her are very scattered because of trauma. Like trauma literally prunes your memory if it's too hurtful or harmful. So, but my last memory, which is quite, even objectively quite sad, was I went to visit her in the psychiatric hospital, and because she'd suicided about 1 week after being discharged from hospital. And this is in the late 90s, where in my city, my country, we'd done a lot of deinstitutionalization work from large asylums to smaller hospitals, but there was very little community mental health support or follow-up. So, my memories are, being in very hospital-based environments that were very, very cold. They weren't very reflective of the love and compassion and warmth that people needed. There were often there was lots of yelling, lots of distress, lots of chaos, which was confusing and scary. And that included my mother. Like, even though at times my father was a perpetrator of abuse, I often felt more safe with him because I was so confronted by my mother's screams and wailing, and that was a lot to deal with as a child, and very confusing. It was very confusing holding that as a kid. Throughout my adolescence, my siblings were in and out of hospital, so I had further experiences of visiting them, and then myself at one point or several points later on was institutionalized as well. So yeah, these places, they're very dehumanizing. They're not reflective of color and warmth and love, and they just lack a lot of humanity.
Is it okay that I ask you about your own institutionalization? How did it come about? What did it entail? And how distressful was it for you? And what do you remember most about it?
Yeah, so the periods between, when my mother died and then in my mid-20s when I was institutionalized, in that period, I was dealing with my sexuality in a largely homophobic community and environment. It was very multicultural, very religious. My family was very religious. So I felt very different and othered from a young age. I was more comfortable playing with girls. I liked cars and masculine things, but I also loved my mother's high heels and dresses and wearing those things and putting on shows for, family members on a Saturday night with a glitter hat. Yeah, we can be all in many things, can't we? So, yeah. But yeah, I had no role models. Like, there was not a lot of representation in media at that time, and I think I was dealing with the grief and trauma of my mother. I mean, the body and mind are incredible. Like, obviously I'd suppressed a lot of it, but I didn't go to school at all for when I was at the age of 11 and 14, I went to school about 20% of the time. I used to hide under the bed to avoid going to school in the morning, where the teacher would be knocking at the door saying, Matthew, we didn't have a school counselor, of course, in the 2000s. So it was just like the music teacher that had a psychology background. So I was obviously living with what we would now call like depression, severe depression and anxiety, but there was no one to name that or support me through that experience. Moving forward, say 10 years later, I was very badly bullied in a mental health workplace as an advocate, and that led to me having severe suicidal thoughts. And I very seriously attempted to take my life after about 6 months of trying to avoid work. And there was a point where it all just came to a crisis. I kept avoiding work and I lied to my manager. I said, I've lost my phone up in the mountains and I'll have to go back there and collect my phone to give myself a few more days, because I couldn't bear going into work. I was crying on the phone to my dad driving into work, and it was horrible. I was shutting the door and I didn't want to speak to people, and my mind had literally become a prison. I'd become imprisoned in a civil war with myself. So, but again, it was a response to the context, the environment, with this co-worker that was saying awful things about me, and she was retiring and I was taking over her job, and she was essentially sabotaging my role and work after she retired. So yeah, I was institutionalized. I tried to take my life and it didn't work. And I went to my dad and he took me to hospital and I was there for a few months. And that was a very confronting experience. I mean, in many ways, again, multiple truths, it probably saved my life. And it made me realize that I needed to get my life back on track and stop avoiding things because I've been avoiding since I was a kid. Like that was a coping strategy of avoidance. Yeah, my sexuality, my mum, child welfare. Like I had so much shame. I had so many things to be ashamed of that I was very good at masking and hiding. And obviously as an adult, that can only get you so far. So yeah, I experienced, electroconvulsive therapy and I'd experienced a lot of harms in the hospital. Like I said before, a lot of wailing and screaming and people medicating you just so that you could sleep, just not the right environment, you know what I mean? But there were positives, like art therapy and, people really did, that first time people really did come around and support me as well. I have to say though, like I think the harms have often outweighed the things that have helped in an institutional environment. And I know that people go through many, many things that are worse than my own experience. But yeah, the treatment also led to a manic episode. So being on high levels of antipsychotics and antidepressants led to having a manic episode. So I went in with one diagnosis and came out with many more, and then that led to other, issues of stigma and discrimination in education, employment, losing my license, all those sorts of things.
2 quick follow-up questions. Was it electrotherapy, you said?
It's the electroconvulsive therapy, or in the psychiatric survivor community, we call it electroshock.
Electroshock. Let's call it electroshock. Why was it administered to you?
It was at a time where I wasn't speaking to my parent, my dad primarily. I was not having a very good relationship with him. And my brother and sister and mum had all used electroshock, treatment or therapy. And often what psychiatrists do, because there's not a very strong biological basis to psychiatry, they'll often base it on like past interventions that have worked for yourself or the family. It's not really based on any like biological indicator. It's just like, oh, well, if this worked for your mum or if this worked for your siblings, well, we'll give this a go for you. So I felt very coerced into using it, but I was, as many of us are, we're at like the end of our tether, we're distressed, we're in despair, we're looking for answers. And for me, I was like, if this doesn't work, nothing will. So I sort of had my arm twisted because the psychiatrist was actually my brother and sister psychiatrist in the public setting. And he said, look, let's try this. I've seen it work for your siblings. And I didn't have anyone to consult because my primary caregiver was my dad. And I wasn't speaking very much. I was selectively mute at that time as well because of the depression. So yeah, it was a combination of a lot of factors, but it wasn't a very choice-based. There could have been a lot of other things tried before that.
Is it still legal?
Yes, yeah, it's legal all over the world.
In Australia?
And yeah,
all over the world.
So Australia is actually one of the highest proponents of using ECT. We have a very high prevalence of using it. It's not used like how you see it in the movies in like, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest or whatever. It's used at a much lower rate in terms of the convulsions, and instead of like using stimulation on both sides, they usually will try on one side of the brain first. So there's a lot of what they say least restrictive approaches to ECT now, but it's still it's still convulsing the body. It's literally electrifying and supposedly reigniting parts of the brain that have stopped igniting. So and a lot of parts of the world people are using it barbarically, like without anesthesia. So you need anesthesia because of the impact that it's having. Even just the shaking on your body, you can break bones. And some parts of the world are still using, like people are going through it without any form of anesthesia, which is literal torture.
And you also mentioned having a manic episode. What is a manic episode?
Yeah, so a manic episode is kind of like not the opposite, but in converse to depression, in that your mood becomes elevated. You have lots of racing thoughts and ideas. You start making very impulsive decisions. Like at one point in 1 month, I bought and sold 5 cars, and I was very resentful towards my dad. So I was getting him to sell the cars as a means to make money and profit. Yeah, having lots of dangerous sex, just making a lot of decisions like, I don't know, walking out in front of cars without realizing. So at times it could be very dangerous. And sometimes you could have a mixed episode of mania and be suicidal, which is actually that category has the highest suicide rates across any mental health diagnosis, is when you have mania, like a mixed episode with depression. But in mania, what we often don't talk about is also the like positive and meaning-based aspects of madness. So I was having a lot of like grandiose thoughts about the world, how to change the world. I was writing political speeches, reams of speeches at all hours of the night, sending off emails to international activists and lawyers and CEOs about what I think the world needed to change in regards to mental health and its broader intersections. And it literally took me to international activism. So, someone responded to an email at 3 a.m. in Europe and said, I love what you're saying. They, of course, didn't realize that I was going through this period of madness. But what I was saying, there was a lot of truth and meaning to the experiences that I was having. It wasn't illness, it wasn't a pathology. Yes, it was distressing and impairing at times, but it was also beautiful, meaningful, and I was full of wisdom, you know what I mean? I sort of miss being in those periods of ecstasy. It's like taking a drug, but it's a natural drug,
Yeah. Talking of psychiatric institutions, what do you think that people who have never experienced psychiatric institutions most often misunderstand about them?
That they're solely helpful and that they're about treatment and support. And for some people, they do get help. And there's been times in my life where I have come across some lovely nurses or a lovely social worker or a lovely peer worker in an institution. I have to say most of the therapy comes from other patients though, and talking to other people, because the walls are down, everyone's in there for a reason. And it's sort of like, well, no one can hide anymore from their problems in the outside world. So we only really have each other to speak to. So I think there's this misconception that maybe everyone's like secluded in a room and that it's all doom and gloom, and or it's the opposite, that people think that it's a sanctuary and a place of help and healing. So I think those binaries are very unhelpful, because it can be all of those things. But I think the magic happens in the relationships with other peers. And I can remember other people going through madness, psychosis, saying really like meaningful things to me about, people that go through mental health issues, like we're bestowed with something special, we have sensitivities to the world, and just things that I would never have experienced from sane people, like it really came from madness and the depths of our humanity, which that's what I think of madness. It's like the spectrums and depths of our humanity.
I'd like to talk for a moment about the queerness aspect that you have raised. And I'm curious to understand when you first realized that you were queer, and mostly how that shaped your sense of self.
Yeah, well, I had two coming outs, because I came out as queer when I was 19 or gay, and then I identify as queer now, and then came out as non-binary through a manic episode. So it took me to experience madness to realize that I was multi-spirited, because when I was manic, I was talking to my mum and having all these, spiritual revelations, I guess one would call it. Lights were flickering, sunlight was shining on me. I was having a lot of these euphoric moments that resulted in coming out as non-binary to honour my mother's spirit. And at times I was using we, us pronouns as well, because I felt like I was representing a community of spirits. But before that, I realised I was attracted to the same gender or sex when I was probably like 11 or 12. Like many of us, we realise around puberty that we're having sort of more physical sexual. But I knew something was different about me at a much younger age than that, though. And then again, because of the religious, homophobic environment I grew up in, I was very suicidal from 18, 19. I went to university. I couldn't make friends because I didn't want them to know. I knew that to make friends, I needed to reveal myself and be really deep with people, and I was still in that pattern of avoidance. So it took me to become suicidal that first time, to make a choice, an ultimatum of, Matthew, you either come out and live, or you live in shame and you die alone. And then, of course, over the years, I've identified more broadly than as a gay male, more as like a queer, non-binary person. Mm-hmm. Much like madness, queerness and gender, they're all spectrums and variations of human experience.
How did you begin to build a life beyond all of these experiences? What role did moving to Canada play in that journey?
The Canada journey is more of a temporary journey, but I've been away for quite a period of time, which seems to be the case the last few years. I trained as a social worker at university, and then I did my final social work placement in a forensic hospital with people that are found not guilty of their offence by reasons of mental impairment. So the old school stigmatised criminally insane, essentially, which of course we don't use those terms. So I worked in a large forensic hospital for the first 3 years of my life, career, which is where I was badly bullied. And I worked mostly as a lived experience consultant. So I would run lots of focus groups and hear from the patients what they wanted changed in the hospital because they lived there. They were there for like on average 8 to 10 years. So I would raise these issues to executive. They want water coolers on the units, or they want to talk more about their dreams and aspirations and recovery and in meetings, all sorts of different things. And I think the culmination of lived, learned and laboured experiences led me to international activism. And in that time I started a PhD, and then I dropped out because I was institutionalised like 8-9 times. So I ended up coming back to the PhD with the topic that I loved, which was based on my activism sort of work and career of working with other lived experience activists around the world. So, in many ways, everything has sort of happened for a reason to some extent. Not everything. I don't believe in that wholeheartedly, but I do believe that we also can make our own luck too. And if we follow our passion and our values and we're our authentic selves, I do think that that goes a long way. It's not the same for everyone. I have to acknowledge I have a lot of privileges as well. I'm white, I'm educated, I'm from Australia. I have to acknowledge those things too.
What is your PhD in?
So my PhD is understanding the international or transnational MAD movements. MAD obviously has a lot of historical negative connotations and has been used in a more pejorative way, much like insane, crazy, psycho. These are all sanist or mentally or emotionally ableist terms. So what the MAD movements have done have reclaimed MAD as queer had been reclaimed from its negative and pejorative use in society. MAD has been reclaimed as a political, cultural and community identity to push back and resist against psychiatrization or being labelled mentally ill, essentially, and saying we actually have an identity outside of the system. We're not just service users of the system. We're not just survivors of the system. We're mad people. We don't need an identity label that's associated with the system. So that's where that comes from. And it's sort of evolved more so from mad pride, which is, where people have found a source of pride and wisdom in their madness, and also celebrate the artistic, creative and cultural production of mad people. We have such rich histories of in the arts, in history, in film, media, TV. So that part of it's also celebrating that we have a lot to offer in the context of a society that has, promoted eugenics and the death of the mentally ill and just general discrimination in society. So it's about resisting back and saying we're people that have worth, dignity, value, autonomy in society, and we don't deserve to be stigmatized, discriminated against, and effectively, killed under many regimes, authoritarian regimes.
Stigma remains one of the main reasons for people not to seek help when they know that they need help. In spite of all the campaigns and all the, phone lines and so on and so forth, there is a huge amount of stigma there. And somebody might lend you a hand, but then that kind of stays on your record somehow. And at some point or another, when you're trying to get things done in your life, it will come back to haunt you. The fact that you ever raised your hand and you said, hey, I need help right now. From the wealth of experience that you have in this field and your studies as well, your activism, all the advocacy you do, and of course, mostly your lived experience. What works when it comes to trying to defy stigma?
Well, I think there's 3 important distinctions, firstly, because there's stigma or the negative association, then there's discrimination, like the action, and then there's the oppression underlying that, which is sanism, which is that mad people are to be feared, that they're less human, and, they're not to be, trusted or not credible. So there's all these sort of tropes around madness or mad people versus, sane people, right, that underlie sort of stigma, which is sort of the more wishy-washy end. But I think what works is social contact, of course. So encountering people with these diagnoses and realizing that they're just human like yourself is very humanizing and obviously builds compassion and empathy. So particularly for people, we've done a lot of work around stigma around anxiety, depression, but everything's clumped under this umbrella of mental health. But when we talk about madness, we're really talking about altered and extreme states, like psychosis, mania, suicidality, personality-related disorders, quote unquote. So a lot of what works is social contact, but also we need to be campaigning not just around stigma, but more broadly around the oppression, around sanism, and also how sanism intersects with racism, with classism, with sexism. People of color or black folks are disproportionately institutionalized when they have a diagnosis of schizophrenia, for example. So there's some work to be done more around addressing the oppression rather than stigma, which doesn't have any sort of legal or human rights weight, like discrimination and sanism. So I'm very big on talking about mental ableism as a form of oppression and how it intersects with other oppressions. And I think campaigning around that and the deeper root causes is an important part alongside the social contact work.
That's a great point that you make. What you're saying is probably that stigma is perhaps a symptom or a side effect of a bigger problem, which is sanism in this case, which is, of course, intersected with racism and sexism. What is sanism, by the way? How would you define it?
Yeah, like mental and emotional forms of ableism. So if someone discriminates against you because you have a physical disability or in a wheelchair, they think you don't have the same capacities. That same thing happens in regards to people's mental capacities. So people, for instance, will have lower expectations of you. They will think that you don't have the same capacities. Or as you said, people carry around markers of diagnosis in their reports. So medical professionals and health professionals view you in a different way. So you go to the general practitioner with, you're having physical complaints, and then they say, oh, you have a history of anxiety. Well, it must be a mental health issue. So these are all little microcosms of sanism, of how it infiltrates. And obviously sanism we see in the workplace. If you have mental health issues, people can discriminate. In a lot of countries, you can't marry or have the right to property or the right to medical insurance if you have mental health issues. This is all sanism. That's all pervasive sanism, where mental health is used in an oppressive and discriminatory way systemically, as well as interpersonally. So interpersonally, in conversation, people say, oh, she's crazy, or they're mad, or they're insane, or she's having a borderline moment. That's all sanist terminology, and we don't call it out. We don't even name it like we do homophobia or racism, because it's just not even discussed at an awareness raising level. So I'm very passionate about that area, both interpersonally and systemically. How do we campaign around the underlying oppression rather than be talking about stigma?
Can you tell me, as we bring this to a close, one term that we should stop using? For example, I've learned from the work that my sister does around disability that we should not use the word dumb the way that we do, because of course it's very detrimental when it comes to the deaf and dumb, for example. What is one word that you think is overused in society and should stop being used precisely for the reasons you've just offered us?
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing that, because dumb, idiot, imbecile, they were all, intellectual disability diagnostic classifications in the in the institutional era for people that were seen as also mad. Like they were all put together in the one institution often. So that's a great example of sanism as well. I think, I think the common words in different languages, like people use mad in pejorative ways and crazy and insane. I think that there's some very key words that we use to often put down people or dismiss someone's like truth or credibility. So that's like sanism in operation, you know what I mean? Where these terms have these historical pejorative uses. Lunatic is another one. So I think crazy, insane, lunatic are some very commonplace words that people still use in everyday language that need to be called out. And people just need to be educated as well, because we just don't know what we don't know.
You're absolutely right. As you were speaking, I thought of the way that we use the word crazy. And sometimes we use it to refer to something that we find unbelievable. And, by default, that means that then the person is not to be believed, that crazy person. So it really kind of dehumanizes and takes away so much agency. Is there anything else, Matt, before we close this, that you would like to share with us?
No, other than the future will hopefully hold a PhD conclusion next year. And I've interviewed 44 MAD activists or lived experience-led activists around the world to hear about what mental health advocacy they're doing in their country, their region, and more globally. And what does this mean more broadly for the future of the MAD movement? So, yeah, I'm looking forward to sharing more about that journey over when I conclude mid to late next year. So, yeah, hopefully we can have another conversation at some point to check in, and I know we'll catch up at some point anyway. But yeah, thank you for having me. It's been wonderful, and I really appreciated getting to deep dive a bit into some of the areas of my passion as well. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Matthew. It's been a real pleasure, privilege to spend this time together, and thank you once again for sharing your story with such openness and generosity.